Hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I am Robin Browne, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And tonight I'm joined by my regular co-host, Libby Davies.
Well, thanks very much, Robin. My name is Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the traditional and ancestral territory of Treaty 4 in Saskatchewan.
All right. Well, with us tonight are Eriel Deranger, Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. Hello, Eriel. Clayton Thomas-Müller, author and activist. Hello, Clayton. Political advocacy and communications professional Sabrina Grover. Hello, Sabrina. Joining us for the first time, I believe. Joel Harden, former Ottawa Centre NDP member of Ontario's provincial parliament and federal NDP candidate for Ottawa Centre in 2025 in the 2025 election. And Karl Nerenberg, Rabble's parliamentary reporter. Welcome to all of you and looking forward to the discussion. Welcome also to our audience joining us on Zoom tonight. We hope you participate in the chat and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. We'll do our best, as always, to address your questions. Well, in tonight's Off the Hill, we'll examine two very related topics, pipelines and land back. During the federal election campaign, Prime Minister Mark Carney committed to building Canada, quote, into an energy superpower, but wasn't clear where he stood on pipelines. However, since being elected, he's made clear through the tabling of the Building Canada Act, as it's called, he's very much pro-pipeline. His minority government has said it will reduce the time needed to approve projects from 5 years to 2, quote, all while upholding Canada's world-leading environmental standards and its constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples, unquote. The speech from the throne that outlined government priorities was read by King Charles and didn't mention land back, which begs the question, can the government build pipelines while addressing climate change and upholding its constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples? Let's see what our panelists think. Over to you, Libby, to get us started.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robin. There's lots to get into tonight. But we're going to begin actually with Joel. And while, as you've heard, our panel today is mostly focused on pipelines and land back, I think it's helpful to begin with the context of Mark Carney's government, his first 60 days as Prime Minister, especially as we've just had the G7. So to you, Joel, what are the main takeaways from Parliament's first few weeks?
Well, thanks, Libby, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here. I would say there are two large narratives that are swirling around in our city, and Sabrina and Robin can think differently than me, perhaps. We all are in the same city here. One narrative is big disappointment in the notion that the full court press that the fossil fuel industry put on towards the end of the election, 38 executives writing an open letter to Carney calling for speeding up pipeline approvals, infrastructure approvals, the end to the industrial carbon tax, the end to the emissions cap in oil and gas. It would seem that Carney is responding directly to that. That's the critical take. The charitable take is to say, oh, he's playing 3D chess. You know, he's saying yes to pipelines, but he knows that these pipeline projects aren't going to be funded, and therefore he's going to focus more on unifying electrical systems. You know, I hear that as well from neighbors. What matters to me the most is that our country is not divided by the fossil fuel industry, and that's what I see going on here. I see their full court press to do whatever they can to extract every single cent from our shared earth towards their very short-term minded goals. And what I want to see is a prime minister that's going to stand up very clearly with the science and with the evidence and with our constitutional obligations and say emphatically, no, let's follow the lead of the green energy revolution that's happening around the world.
And how, just a quick follow-up, Joel, how is that playing out in Parliament itself? It's a minority Parliament. Is he getting pushback?
Well, the Conservatives, the official opposition, have said they're going to vote in favor of Bill C5. That's very clear. I've seen Organized Labor offer some critical support for for Bill C5. So we've got, some major institutional players in the country that seem to be persuaded of the merits of this bill. But again, what I'm hearing from neighbors here is we have to deal with the world that actually exists and not play this 3D chess game of let's pacify the fossil fuel industry and actually do stuff on the other hand. I come from the school of thought, Libby, and I know you do too, that it's best to be straight with voters. It's best to be direct. And I don't think energy workers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, Labrador, BC, or anywhere else are helped by inflating expectations of massive 12, 15-year infrastructure projects that'll be stranded assets at the end. I want to see those energy workers put to work in building the next energy economy. And many of them are already doing it. They're already doing it right now. And I want to see our federal government get behind them with subsidies and not the fossil fuel industry.
Right. Thank you for that. Eriel, let's go to you. On June the 5th, your organization, Indigenous Climate Action, released its Phase 2 report on decolonizing climate policy. The Phase 2 report is a follow-up to the Phase 1 report that Indigenous Climate Action released in December 2023. So can you first start by just explaining what it means to decolonize climate policy, and then we'll get into the report.
Just in a short little summary, I think that the reality is this new or this latest version that we've released, Phase 2 of Part 2 of our decolonizing climate policy work, is titled "Land Back as Climate Policy." And so when we talk about decolonizing climate policy, it's about recentering the values that drive policies that govern the land, the people, and our systems that we use to survive and thrive. And for us, this is rooted in an ideology of land back, but really what that means is interconnections with the land. We cannot be developing and continuing to develop and be guided by colonial policy that is disconnected from the lands and from the peoples that have existed in these lands and territories since time immemorial. So this report and the series of reports that we've done on decolonizing climate policy are really calls to action about how we can recenter and imagine policies that are away from colonial systems and structures that aim to control and work against the well-being of people and the planet. And so we're reimagining what climate policy could and should be rooted in. The understanding that Indigenous approaches to policy are grounded in self-determination and sovereignty of each individual Indigenous nation. And the conversations that we've had over the last few years, really starting in 2020, really 2019, really looks at like what it means for us to look at Indigenous policies. Rather, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. So we're not trying to create a homogenous like pan-indigeneity, but we think that policies should be respective to each diverse nation. And there's no one silver bullet or way to move forward with climate policies, but they need to be grounded in the community's natural laws and ways of being, rather than being imposed on communities from a top-down approach. We think that Indigenous-led solutions need to be rooted in traditional knowledges, and that these are not some sort of antiquated going back to, but rather they're innovative. They're creative solutions that tackle modern problems and the current crises we're in. And so this isn't about just looking at the standard sort of off-the-shelf approaches we think about when we think of climate policy. You know, we often think of just transition and energy transformation, which we need, but we also need to have a shift in our value systems that drive policies. And so many of the calls to action in this are talking about what are those alternatives? What are the alternatives to the standard approaches that we look at? This is relocalizing governance and economies, reconnection to land, culture, and language. This is revitalization and the resurgence of Indigenous food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, including taking care of the lands and waters, taking care of the forests, taking care of our animal relatives and their habitats, taking care of our cities, taking care of our wastes, transforming legal systems to protect what we value and require. And when you start to really reimagine decolonial climate policy, it is about shifting away from these ideologies of colonial capitalism that has put us in the crisis that we're in. So we need to look at ways to recenter Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and decentering settler ways. We need to respect the assertion and the defense and the of land defenders, of respecting Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty and consent. I don't want to hear any more about consultation, which is really worrisome what we're hearing with Carney. When we're watering down and speeding up the processes for approvals, we're further degrading the free, prior, and informed consent that is upheld in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we're watering it down to a further degradation of consultation when in fact we have legally affirmed rights for consent. We need to be able to say yes or no to projects, and we need to be talking about the redistribution of power, wealth, and land, i.e. land back. And of course, we need to decentralize climate governance and building community power. So we need to be talking about how we can have community power rather than top-down approaches, and building intersectional, powerful international movements that ensure accountability across the board for all of our communities and move towards reparations. Because the current path we're on is just about continuing to build, amass political and economic power at all costs and any cost. And that tends to be people and the planet, that tends to be Indigenous communities and those that are most marginalized. And we desperately need a movement towards decolonial climate policy and a movement towards Indigenous land back.
Thank you.
Okay.
Libby.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, over to Sabrina now. Let's bring you in. We mentioned in the introduction Bill C5, the Building Canada Act. I think it was the second bill that the Prime Minister introduced, but it's certainly a core economic and political foundation, Sabrina. And we're very interested to get your perspective on that in terms of Carney's agenda and how you see that. And is he going to run into trouble in meeting climate commitments and Canada's constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples? I mean, we've heard some of that from Eriel, but just to get your take on that from Carney's perspective, how you see him thinking that through.
Yeah, thanks so much, Libby. And I really do appreciate Eriel's perspective and also the work that organization has done in this field. I think let me start with a bit of a high level kind of look, I think, in response to what Joel had to say in terms of how Mark Carney is being received. So some of the recent polling on both this issue and on Mark Carney's government or mandate so far is looking positive, right? So right now we have about 67% of total approval for Carney across the country. When you get down to issues of whether it's building this one economy, or we even talk about the speed of projects, you have over 70% approval rates on the performance of the government, either as good or acceptable in the speed of major projects and building infrastructure. And that includes, of course, this idea of pipelines. And, we've got over 70% of support in building the Canadian economy in accordance with Bill C5, kind of removing those trade barriers to interprovincial trade and identifying and expediting nation building projects. So there is a lot of support, and that support is consistent across the country, which is unique for the first time, I think, including in Mark Carney's performance, that including in Alberta, which is actually where I am, Joel, not in Ottawa, but including in Alberta, there is a lot of support for the work that he's doing, and I think a lot of it is because of the external threats that people are facing or are perceived to be facing from the United States, right? The United States is a really unpredictable partner, and we've seen that even in the last 4 days. So I think just kind of using that as stage setting is, while I do think that they are going to run into many issues in how they have so far engaged with First Nations and Indigenous communities, there is still support broadly for getting projects built and making sure that Canada can be an energy superpower. And an energy superpower doesn't mean just conventional oil and gas. And you've heard Tim Hodgson and Mark Carney, and including actually Premier Smith, surprisingly, talk about some of these clean energy projects. I think Premier Smith remains to be seen whether or not she actually thinks that that's important or falls back onto, this idea of conventional oil and gas only. I think the number one thing, in addition to this free prior and informed consent that needs to be obtained, is what is the economic partnership between Canada and First Nations. And what is the economic partnership that ensures that there is an economic side to reconciliation in building these projects, that it isn't at the expense of any group, and that it isn't at the pain of any one group, but that it does become an economic partnership and true partnership in terms of that reconciliation path forward. And I think that that hasn't been identified yet. So it's not to say that perhaps it won't come, but I will say that it is going to cause some problems for the Carney government in getting projects done if they don't identify that. And if they don't identify a path forward for a good working relationship right from the beginning. And they have lacked on that development of a good working relationship, or they haven't been able to identify it for us yet. What I'd like to see, I think, is a greater presence of not just Tim Hodgson in these conversations, but additionally the presence of you know, the people who are the ministers who are negotiating or charged with negotiating with First Nations, and we haven't seen that at all. And there was a lot of work done in that was moving in the positive direction under Justin Trudeau, and it seems to have either stalled or we don't actually know where it's going. And I think again that needs to become more relevant and more front of mind for the Carney government. I think that there's an opportunity on that side to move forward, but so far I don't think we have the the path forward on that.
All right. Thank you for that, Sabrina. All right. Let's Clayton, let's bring you in. You are a consistent advocate for land back and Indigenous rights. The government's new mega bill we've been talking about, Bill C-5, the Building Canada Act, allows the government to bypass key provisions that guarantee consultation with Indigenous communities and environmental stuff. What impact will this have?
Well, first and foremost, bonjour, danse, them. Hello to all the listeners that are checking in from across these lands they call Canada. I wanted to just first and foremost recognize the 31,000 plus climate refugees that have been evacuated from over 35 First Nations, in fire zones across the north. Climate change continues to be a very disruptive and very violent and unpredictable thing, especially for frontline communities that are impacted not just by climate change, but also by the extractive industries here in Canada that are driving climate change in terms of disruption of water security and food security and the violation of treaty and inherent rights. Now, right now, I'm just having all kinds of traumatic flashbacks of the omnibus bill under Prime Minister Harper way back in the day when the great First Nations women of these lands stood up under the guise of Idle No More and, put a big challenge out. And of course, that was the beginning of the demise of the Harper regime and the lead to this now current liberal system. I agree with a lot of commentary that, Carney is presenting just as bad as the Conservatives. It's no wonder they're voting for the Omnibus Bill C-5. It's really important to understand that, we're deep right now in the battle of the story. The government will put out their assumptions or their understanding of the current political and geopolitical or whatever landscape, and especially their interpretation of their relationship with Indigenous peoples. They'll put that shit out there in the media, right? And Indigenous peoples will put our stuff out there as well. And at the end of the day, this stuff is fought out in a couple different places, and I think most notably on the colonial side of things in the Supreme Court of Canada. And so, as our national chief, Cindy Woodhouse, said today in the media, we're in court right now. We'll continue to be in court. And, in response to Bill C-5, this will probably end up in the court. And the government is selling this as a pathway for meaningful engagement, cultural and environmental stewardship. But, this couldn't be more disingenuous. The Act's purpose includes respect for Indigenous rights. But to that end, the Act mentions 6 situations for Crown First Nations consultation concerning large construction projects to extract and transport natural resources on treaty lands. I'm not going to list those out, but the provisions of Bill C5 are really about Canada, Carney trying to put it out there that he pledges to consult with First Nations about the possible infringement of Aboriginal and treaty rights. That vow to consult, however, has nothing to do with Bill C5's passage into legislation. Canada must already consult. It's a permanent feature of settled constitutional law, not a potential consequence of Bill C5. So Bill C5 also speaks about the establishment of a federal major projects office. Now, it's not obvious to me how this new office may differ from the major projects management office established in 2007. Maybe a difference is the appointment of an Indigenous Advisory Council, or advisory bodies. But, historically, advisory bodies and federal things like this have not been known to produce meaningful results for First Nations. And, I think another really important thing is around FPIC. There's a preambular reference in Bill C5 to free, prior, and informed consent. And I know from, previous litigations against Canada's Justice Department that Canada sees the duty to consult and FPIC as the same thing. Again, interpretations. And it is therefore doubtful that Bill C5's implicit reference to FPIC will improve in any way Canada's approach to consulting with First Nations. And we've seen, Canada's devastating record under all political platforms in that note. Bill C5, I think the reality of it is that absolutely little is gained by First Nations. First Nations are about to face a massive and very rapid, accelerated period of rights-threatening resource extraction. And while Bill C5 might boost investor confidence, foreign direct investment in the Canadian economy, for First Nations rights holders, the status quo or business as usual is very much represented by this. And again, this is just the usual dupe and delay tactics of proponents of the fossil fuel sector, of proponents of the critical minerals sector. And it's very troubling. I'm interested to hear what the other regions are dealing with. But here in Manitoba, Carney has prioritized the newly ice-free shipping lanes for, the establishment of new trading routes to free us up from, the dilemma we face with our biggest trading partner, the United States of America. Carney is the darling child of the monarchy of Europe, of the European Union. This guy is really their quarterback that they've pulled out during this time. And so Indigenous peoples, I call out to all of you that this is a time where we have to be coming together, to be having meetings in our community, around the dinner table, at the workplace, in our place of prayer, to, make sure that we're keeping tabs on what's going on with this conversation, because I really feel with this accelerated resource development timeframe that we're facing, and this fast tracking of fiduciary and legal obligation, particularly around consultation and project finance and project ownership. These are very scary times because there's a lot of our Native people, just like any other demographic in Canada, that are, hardcore capitalists. They don't care about the environment. They don't believe in climate science. Well, there's a lot of us Indigenous peoples that do, and we need to be hitting the streets right now and letting our voices heard all across these lands that they call Canada, that we're not going to stand idly by when these folks are coming to try and build pipelines over our salmon producing rivers, or to dredge the Beluga sanctuary in the Hudson Bay so LNG super tankers and coal export barges and oil tankers can come into the Hudson Bay, threatening the food security of Indigenous peoples and northern communities there. We need development in the north. We need highways to be built. We need infrastructure like the purchasing of water bombers and the refunding of the Northern Firefighters Program, which was cut years ago, so that our Indigenous first responders can respond to this new annual reality of massive evacuations of the climate refugees from these fire-stricken zones. Because this problem is not going away, folks. It's only going to get exacerbated, okay? It's only going to get worse, especially if we allow this government to build more pipelines, more shipping lanes to export critical minerals, which is also a water-destroying, super carbon-intensive industry as well, especially if we let Doug Ford have what he wants in the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is the tar sands equivalent of mining, okay? They want to build one of the biggest extractive industry sites in Northern Ontario, comparable only on the planet to the tar sands in terms of scale. And all of those minerals are earmarked to be shipped out of the port of Churchill between the new compact between Doug Ford and Premier Canoe here in the province of Manitoba. So there's a lot of geopolitical shit happening right now, influenced by Trump, influenced by conflict all around the planet, influenced by a rapidly destabilizing climate. And, you know, I want to remind folks in conclusion that right before the amnesia pandemic is what I'm calling it, you know, Canada was shut down at the call of the Wet'suwet'en people, okay, to stop the Coastal GasLink project. We shut down Canada, okay, and every single rail line, every single highway. And it was the young people, it was women, it was Indigenous peoples and social movements. We did that. And then the pandemic happened. Okay. And now here we are after the pandemic talking about freaking Arctic shipping lanes for coal and oil and LNG and the rough trotting over Indigenous people's rights in the era of truth and reconciliation. Well, let me tell you something. The 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are inextricably linked to Canada's action at scale to the global climate crisis. These two things they go hand in hand. And we have a tremendous opportunity right now to tear down our economic paradigm that does not work for our reality and to do something that doesn't sacrifice certain communities at the altar of irresponsible economic and climate policy. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Way to go, Clayton. Thanks so much. And I sure appreciate your call to action. Well, it's a fascinating discussion between you guys so far. And as Joel and Sabrina, I think, laid out at the beginning, we sort of have these two different narratives out there, right? I mean, there's sort of like a certain public view that, you know, this guy's doing okay, and yet are we headed for possibly big trouble? And so I want to bring Karl in, because Karl, you're a long time watcher of things on Parliament Hill, and you've already been writing about C5, you've been writing about what Doug Ford has been doing. So I'm very interested in your take on this, not only in terms of the bill itself, Bill C5, and what it means, because I think we've covered some of that, but really, what is the longer term impact? Is Carney now dug himself into a certain course that will be difficult to get out? Or do you think there's still a lot of room here in terms of what may happen in the future? Just if you could just kind of project a little bit about how you think this is going to play out, Karl.
I never lose hope. And I really appreciated what Sabrina said, actually, saying, well, that the government has been allowed the most business-oriented cabinet minister to take control and to be the lead figure in its current strategy, the Build Canada strategy, and the strategy to accelerate infrastructure projects, and supposedly as a response to Trump's threats. So I want to say what I hear from the government and what I hear from supporters of Carney in the attitude, leaving aside the environment, just the attitude towards Indigenous rights, is Indigenous rights are treated as an inconvenience, a hurdle, an obstacle. Indigenous people as people to be patronized, consulted, shunted aside. And I say to this government, I wrote an article yesterday, here's a constructive idea. I'm inviting people to read it. I direct the government to the Indigenous group. If we took a spectrum right to left among Indigenous groups, and we put Clayton somewhere near the left, you would take the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, a very business-oriented group that deals with businesses, a very pro-business group. Look at their principles. I put the principles of the FNMPC into the form of legislation, and I invite Carney, put that in your, if you want to walk the walk with Indigenous people, take the advice of your allies and your friends, of the people you quote as legitimizing and as giving their blessing to what you're doing, because maybe they're going to be very careful and not criticize it. When you read their words, you don't see this anywhere in the legislation. The legislation C5 has a preamble that says nice platitudes that have no impact, but its content says something quite different. It's very sneakily put in. You know, the Conservatives in their day, they were vandals. They would come burn your house down. They would come screaming, we don't like you, we don't agree with you, the sort of always a bit Trump-like. But I'm afraid the Liberals these days are behaving a bit like sneaky cat burglars. They're putting up a front at the beginning, and the first part of the legislation, just to give an example, that makes it seem as though they're entirely favorable and sympathetic to Aboriginal people. There are 3 Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, in this government, in this cabinet. But then you have to comb through in the fine print to say that this legislation allows a minister to suspend a series of provisions of other legislation, and that other legislation requires consultation with Indigenous people. But I say, don't talk consultation, talk true. I love when Sabrina talks economics, because that's been something I've talked about for years. Talk about the key principle of either revenue sharing or equity. Say that a project that is on Indigenous territory, that impinges on Indigenous rights, we're not coming in here to try to get around you, get your begrudging permission, get your kind of quasi, divide you and get some people in your community to give permission, others not to. We're going to come in here and work together with you, and you're going to own, and you're going to be part of what we do. You're going to have true control over what we do. We're not going to talk about an impact benefits agreement. We're going to talk about equity from the get-go. Why can't they put that in the legislation? Because you know what, Mr. Carney should understand. 67% opinion poll. Just think of where Pierre Poilievre was in January of this year. If you believe in opinion polls, opinion polls are worth nothing. They're written in the wind. They're like ice cream sitting in the sun. Forget about them. And aside from that, do the right thing. You're not in politics just to get a few good opinion poll numbers. You're in politics to do something right and lasting. And don't forget, whoever is prime minister after Mark Carney, this is the legislation that they'll have. Please read Althea Raj on this. She's pointed this out. Look, somebody else will be prime minister after Mark Carney. Even if Mark Carney we trust and he's really benign in his intentions and he won't do terrible things, God knows who's going to come later. And we've given carte blanche to a next prime minister to set aside environmental and Indigenous considerations completely legally. The Conservatives, if they had a minority, wouldn't even have to try to abolish existing environmental legislation that had an impact on Indigenous people, as the Conservatives did with their budget implementation bill that brought about the backlash of the movement of an earlier time, the idle no more movement. Now, no, a new government comes in, existing legislation allows them to basically do what they want with what existing environmental legislation and existing duty to consult Indigenous people. So I've written an article here. Look at Althea Raj has been very careful and sympathetic. 20 years in Parliament Hill, she says, I've never seen an example of such an undemocratic process. She is a person who's generally supported the Liberals and generally sympathetic to the Liberals. We're not getting good press coverage. The press is playing into the situation where the phony baloney kabuki theater of the G7 is gobbling up all the attention, and there's a real war in Iran and the Middle East. So this is not getting press attention. I look at the Ottawa Citizen and the National Post is not there. The CBC News at 6 o'clock tonight did not cover this at all. They had no stories on it. So in a way, the government's going to get away with putting through legislation in a week that Stephen Harper would never do. When Stephen Harper put through obnoxious legislation, he at least took a few months to do it. He at least had parliamentary committees have hearings. This has never been done in our history.
Yeah, we're going to try and get in one last question to all of you before we go to audience questions. Robin?
Actually, yeah, we're going to. And Clayton's already mentioned the fire, so it's about that. But I did want to say one thing before we get to that, and that was in response to what Sabrina said about actually Karl's mentioned this too, the opinion polls, right? Because this is, so putting on my police abolitionist hat right now, right? So you mentioned that the polls are showing that 67% of people approve, and that partly it's in relation to the response to Trump. But what we see again with the police is that, so the Trump thing is what we call the common enemy, right? So what we see with the police is the common enemy is this idea of a rising crime, which actually really isn't backed by the facts. But and they throw out stats like that too, like 67% of people say we need more police, but they don't disaggregate it, right? We don't hear what Black people think. I'd be curious to hear what Indigenous people think, right? Have that data disaggregated, right? So anyway, the question we have, so Clayton mentioned the fires. Hey, it's only June already, and Canada is literally on fire. Is the direction that Carney is taking, is that going to help tackle the wildfires or start more? Anybody can jump in.
Yeah,
I think thank you, Clayton. I think first off, the reality is I just want to touch on one thing. When we talk about revenue sharing or talking about becoming economic partners for Indigenous peoples, I need to caution people on that, thinking that that is the route forward, because it absolutely is not. Coming from a tar sands impacted community, we've seen this already tried within our communities, and it becomes another tool for manipulation or manufacturing consent from communities. And it actually sidesteps the responsibilities for free, prior, and informed consent and reduces the responsibilities for true community consultation. And this is especially exacerbated if you have corrupt leaders that are looking for ways to make a quick buck. And this is not the way forward. This is another way of we talk about greenwashing, we talk about pinkwashing. This is another form of red washing. It also obstructs Indigenous communities' ability to challenge projects if they've said yes or become economic partners in other ones, which is something that my community firsthand has experienced when we tried to challenge the expansion of the Jack Pine Mine project, which stated that since we had already been in agreement with the Shell oil project prior to that, that we just needed to go back to arbitration and mitigation or mediation with the proponent. And this was no longer a matter of the courts. These create safeguards for industries and actually further abrogate the rights of Indigenous communities to say no. So I really don't support the new frameworks for economic reconciliation, because until we have finally figured out what true consent and the rights for communities to say no is, then we can't be talking about economic reconciliation. When we talk about what's going on with Carney and the wildfires, this is another indicator that who are the first and foremost to be impacted? It's Indigenous communities. If we're talking about fast tracking projects, we're talking about fast tracking climate change. We're talking about the fact that the 1.5 target we're already past that. We are heading towards 4 degrees, and fast tracking oil and gas projects is not the way forward. And when we're talking about degrading the rights of Indigenous communities and only talking about economic reconciliation as the way forward, this is not the way forward. My community had to be evacuated last summer. Clayton's community is being evacuated this summer. Our communities are becoming the first climate refugees in this country. And now we're just trying to find ways to buy out the rights of these communities and fast track projects so that Canada can continue to be an economic superpower and an energy superpower at the cost of the people and the climate. I don't think that we are in the right direction. And if we're talking about how we're going to stop this, it's going to be exactly what Clayton said. It's going to be Indigenous peoples that are going to throw down when we say our sovereignty and self-determination is not respected. The calls to action in ICA's Decolonizing Climate Policy Report, redistribution of wealth, decentralized governance. We need to have the sovereignty and self-determination of our communities back if we are going to get back on track to address the climate crisis and have real truth and reconciliation in this country. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, newly put in Minister Rebecca Chartrand for Arctic Affairs or whatever it is. And of course, the new Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, former Grand Chief Mandy Galls from James Bay Cree. I think it's really important for people, we're trying to connect some dots here. It's really important to understand that Carney, a lot of this disingenuous kind of like BS that his government is putting out right now in the media, can also be demonstrated by the fact that he just appointed a junior minister, somebody who has no government experience, into the most politicized, geopolitical charged file in terms of being responsible for the militarization of Nunavut and the establishment of new Arctic trade routes out of the Port of Churchill and overseeing the development of the Port of Churchill. And now, I've only heard rumors, but something called NESTAN in terms of a northern pipeline. I've heard rumors of a coal train from the coal fields of Alberta to Churchill. I've heard talk of a highway from the Northwest Territories through a caribou calving grounds of the Dene people up there, again, to Churchill. Bringing in Grand Chief Mandy Gull, she's excellent. Both her and Rebecca are really good people, but I am concerned You know, the James Bay, communities, these nations are hardcore in bed with the mining companies. These communities are hardcore in bed with the crown, with hydro development, mega hydro development. You know, these communities are very much involved in the status quo of the current economic regime that all of us are being impacted by. Indigenous peoples more so, I would say, though. So having former Grand Chief Mandy Gull come in, and then Rebecca Chartrand, Rebecca grew up here in Winnipeg. She's an amazing advocate for urban issues and things, women's issues, a number of things. But I'm very concerned about what the heck she knows about militarization, about climate science, and about, the realities of dealing with, the extractive industry sector and the revolving door that they have with the Liberal Carney government. So this is all stuff that we've got to, consider while we're mapping out what is actually going on here as we battle for the story. And I couldn't agree more with what's been said about, profit sharing or ownership, the desperate nature of this government now, because we've been kicking ass as Indigenous social movements, right? With the tar sands campaign, with the global climate movement, with Idle No More and many other examples, Standing Rock. And I mean, that's already on the table. The resource group that Karl had mentioned out in BC, I mean, these folks are the ones that are part of the coining of economic reconciliation. Pipelines are never going to be part of the reconciliation conversation. Massive open pit gold mines are not part of reconciliation conversation. And for, capitalist, pro-development Indian people or white folks from the Liberal Carney government and everybody in between that supports that, you don't represent or speak for reconciliation. Okay, it's up to each individual 636 First Nation who has their own unique trust relationship with the apartheid Crown government of Canada. We live in an apartheid country still. All Canadians are governed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereas Indigenous peoples are governed by the Indian Act, and we don't have mobility of rights. Okay, as soon as we leave the reserve, our rights are gone. Right? But Canadians can go province to province, territory to territory, province to territory, and you have your rights protected, guaranteed to you. All right. So we're still dealing with apartheid. We need to map this stuff out and not be fooled by, this pan-indigenization suggestion that, money is going to solve all the problems. No, language, culture, connection to the sacredness of the place where we live, and understanding how to not just speak for ourselves, but to speak for all life in the ecology, the great circle of life that we share. These are things that Native people have been trying to share and teach with folks, and we will continue to do so because we're nice. But we also have no problem getting out there in the streets and shutting Canada down. And I think that the direction that the Carney government is heading, and certainly the direction that the Canoe NDP government is suggesting or putting rhetoric out, around the development of the Port of Churchill, Indigenous peoples, I think we're going to be seeing you out in the streets and out of the lands all summer and into the fall.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that, Joel or Sabrina? The question was about wildfires and what that means. But if you want to pick up on anything else that then we're going to move on to audience questions.
Well, what I would say, Libby, if it's okay to jump in, is it disturbs me when I look around the world at the enormous wasted opportunity Canada seems to be focused on, where we are looking at the economy actually of the last century instead of the economy of the current century. I think of startups that I've run into here in our community, like the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative or Sacred Solar, which I think is across the country now. We've had great engagements with them. I think about the electrical workers in my city and across the country that are ready to integrate hydro systems in a respectable and a responsible way, creating decent jobs with an equity hiring focus. We could have a youth climate corps that could put young people who are desperately looking for work this summer to work in climate-friendly industries led by some of the values that Eriel and Clayton's talking about. It's hard for me to describe my level of frustration that we are very much focused on what's popular and what's saleable when people are anxious and fearful instead of being led by the science and doing the right thing. And I know my children are going to judge me 20 years from now, so I don't know about everybody else, but I'm committed to do what it takes to back up the stuff that Clayton and Ariel are talking about.
Okay. Well, we're going to try and get into audience questions. We've got quite a few that came in, so if not everybody has to answer, if you don't want to, and try and keep your responses short. The first question is, Carney talks about decarbonized oil. How does that work? And is he just spouting fossil fuel propaganda? That's our first audience question.
Carney's reference to decarbonized oil is about as real as economic pipeline reconciliation. It's got about the same value factor as that in any market. So yeah, no, it's it's completely anti-science stand, and it's really disturbing, that the federal Liberal government and the Manitoba NDP government are taking such an anti-Indigenous rights, anti-science position on, this whole fast tracking conversation around Bill C5 and Bill 5 in Ontario. All of this stuff is just the same dupe and delay tactics of extractive industries. And again, I mentioned it's a revolving door between oil companies and mining companies in particular and the Carney Liberal government. And they're the ones who are pushing, ridiculous anti-science statements like that. It's a grossly irresponsible statement.
I just want to add,
I don't think that's necessarily
the Alberta
science.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sabrina.
I'd push back.
Sabrina, go ahead, and then we'll go to Eriel.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily anti-science. I think you've seen a lot of climate organizations like the Pembina Institute come out and support the decarbonization of oil and actually explain what that means, whether it's in terms of methane reductions, electrification, capturing and storing CO2. So I think that there has to be some respect that there is some scientific backing towards a decarbonized oil product, and that it does exist, and the path to that does exist, and there is an intent to move towards that. When we talk about the hopes and goals of organizations, whether they are oil companies or the government, I think there is a recognition that the bottom line doesn't matter if no one's going to buy it. And we know that European partners, as an example, are decarbonizing their own investments, and so we need to as well. And I think that has been a recognition in Alberta.
Sabrina, that's false rhetoric. I mean, that is just false solution rhetoric. There is no science that backs carbon capture and storage. All of the demonstration projects globally have failed. Okay, it is a pipe dream. There is no solution, techno fix to decarbonizing oil. And it has been proven time and time again. And they just keep delaying and delaying for decades on market fixes as well. The corruption capabilities for carbon trading or the commodification of forests to be offsets for big oil or any other fossil fuel sector. I mean, this is all BS designed to buy more time for oil companies and their shareholders to make more money. And I'm sorry, I just cannot accept that decarbonized oil is a scientific statement. That is absolutely false, and I reject that categorically.
I think that also I want to state that they attempted this in the 2010s. The Alberta government made huge promises to reduce emissions per barrel through a method that would now be classified as decarbonizing oil. And it proved a failure because it also, not just the science has proven that it's not effective. Corporations don't want to do it because in order to do it, you would have to make massive investments to do this, and it would affect their bottom lines and their shareholders. There's not a political or economic will to do this from the oil and gas companies. And of course, they're just doing this to try to find time, just like they promised to phase out of the tailings, which they've never done, and are now still continuing to build tailings. These are things that are creating greenwashing tactics to buy them more time, as Clayton stated. And they're doing this because they also want to be the same corporations that are going to own the green energy economies that are coming out. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is just another way for corporations to continue to buy themselves time when it has been proven to not be effective at the scale that's necessary. Sabrina, yes, I've heard that there are small scale impacts on decarbonization, but the scale of the Alberta tar sands alone and to decarbonize that is almost an impossible task from an economic and scientific perspective. It's almost impossible because they've already tried this. So it feels like a really false narrative that is just trying to create hope that allows these corporations to continue business as usual with a promise to decarbonize themselves in the future. So I really think that go ahead.
No, We got to remember the IPCC Doomsday Report that came out 8 years ago. That gave us 10 years to literally shut the tap off of oil, okay, to get off of the fossil fuel economy before we're locked into the worst impacts of our rapidly destabilizing climate and the never-ending wars that brings, okay? This is a 99.9% consensus representational scientific report from the world's global scientific community. Now, that 1.02% of scientists that go against that report, they tend to work for companies like Suncor or Syncrude, okay? And so, and again, I mentioned the revolving door between those the special interests and the Liberal government. And so we have to be very careful about these kinds of buzz terms because they come up, whenever governments get desperate and are trying to push a story to win the battle of the story.
That's actually a really good segue into the next question. Seeing as most Canada's a big country, most people get their information not directly from people, but through the media. All right, how do media and misinformation factor into everything we've discussed tonight? Again, anyone can jump in.
I'll jump in quickly on the media, just because I made a quick reference earlier to the fact that the government is presenting very significant and consequential legislation and passing it in historically record time. And Parliament hasn't done anything since last year. So the members of Parliament have only been back since May. Now, artificially, we're saying, well, they'll have to leave on Friday. That's their last day. That's not written in any kind of metaphysical way. That's not determined by the laws of physics. That's just a political decision. And the media, to the extent to which people get their news from the agglomerated mainstream media, completely ignoring the whole thing. This story, I mean, when we had previously, when the government was presenting, the Harper government was presenting this huge omnibus bill in the guise of a budget implementation bill that really offended Indigenous people for good reason and the environmental community, there was coverage of it. So that aroused opposition. This time there's like a conspiracy of silence with the entire media community that we just haven't got the energy or time to cover all these different things happening at once. Weirdly, the CBC, just to take the example of the organization I worked for many years, has a bureau of about 40, 50 people here, and yet they're hardly covering what's happening here. The entire energy of the CBC is out in Kananaskis covering the theatricality of a G7, which really amounts to nothing in the end. It's all just political theatrics and image, and there's no significant or important decision taken. I can't say they shouldn't cover the war between Israel and Iran, because that's a real war and real people are dying. So that is sucking energy away. But to allow Donald Trump's shenanigans to suck energy away from covering what is really going on here, and there's no excuse whatsoever. Whatever disagreements we have here, and there's significant disagreements with Sabrina and me to some extent, have a little overlapping on the one hand, and Clayton and Eriel. None of us think that there's any excuse whatsoever for rushing this legislation through in ridiculous time. However urgent the situation created by Donald Trump's threats, if we took 2 or 3 weeks more to consider it, that wouldn't change anything whatsoever, because the politicians are just going on vacation after this. But the politicians who work
Carl,
in July.
Jump in there. Thanks, Carl. I'm going to jump in there because we're going to try and get in one last question. And it's fine to have disagreements, by the way. It's good spirited debate. So thank you all for that. Strongly held opinions, which is good. We've had a few questions coming in from folks saying, wow, I want to get involved. They're concerned. So I think that would be a very good question to end on in terms of each of the perspectives that you have. What advice do you have for people who want to get involved in this issue? They want to track the bill. They want to get involved in direct action. They want to, what can they do? Just some quick responses from each of you about how you think people can get involved in this issue, because it's obviously really caught people's attention. Who'd like to go? Eriel, how about you? What can people do?
You can,
concretely to get involved.
Yeah, I think that there are ways to get involved to support Indigenous communities. One is, I would say, a very concrete thing is like, go ahead, take a look at our website, read our reports, our calls to action, donate, of course. But really, some of the things to do to sort of occupy your minds is when we call for decolonization, it's around moving away from this movement towards indigenizing colonial structures and moving towards respecting the sovereignty and self-determination of communities. This means communities' rights to say no, not just figuring out a way to absorb them into the current colonial constructs, which have never served our communities. We have to respect the self-determination and sovereignty of communities and the reconnections back to land. That is my biggest call to action, but there are more on our website.
All right. Great. Sabrina, any ideas about how you would want to encourage people to get involved?
I think I'd say like I'd start just by reaching out to organizations in your community, whether those are climate, organizations. Like really being direct in your community is probably the easiest way to understand the impacts. And then I'd also say, for folks who do want to get involved with the parties, reach out to a constituency association. Make sure that you go to local events with your constituency association and use that as an opportunity to learn more and ask questions. Because if you aren't able to, get all the information that you need from the media, you may be able to get some of this information in those local community meetings with your fellow, politically involved or policy involved folks.
Okay, great idea. Karl, any thoughts from you about how to get involved?
My friend Susan Tanner, who's listening, put a list of organizations only to the host and panelists. So I think we should share that list and others with other people. That's one thing we can do. I just suggested in my last article that if you're a person who previously tended to vote Green or NDP, or maybe voted Liberal, but considered himself, herself, themselves to be on the progressive side of things, let your member of parliament or the prime minister's office know, or any senior cabinet ministers know you're not happy with what they're doing right now with Bill C5.
Okay, so good idea. So give feedback before the House rises for the summer. Very good. And we'll go to Joel, and then Clayton, you're going to get the last word, but it's got to be fast. We've got a couple of minutes. So Joel and then Clayton.
Well, I'm gonna put my labor movement hat on, Libby, because that's where I like to live. And that's what I think about a lot. And I think it's time for us to embrace a community-oriented approach to this energy moment that we're in. And I think a lot about the fact that we have been stuck in market solutions for a long time, whether it was the carbon tax or whether it was intricate networks of various things that would attract international investment to solve our problems. Our communities will solve our problems. I believe in the capacity of people who live in this place we call Canada, who build things, who look after things, who take care of things, to do incredible stuff. But we need to fund those local initiatives like we currently, unfortunately, fund the fossil fuel industry, despite a long record of promises to end those subsidies and bring them back to communities. So I'm thinking of my labor folks, Indigenous labor folks working in the oil sands, working in different places. They deserve opportunities. Their families deserve opportunities, and we shouldn't be forcing them into a dead-end future for themselves, their communities, our country, the world.
Okay, thanks for that. Clayton, you've got the last word, but fast.
Yeah,
I know
we
you
need.
fast.
Speaking of labor, they've got some pretty deep social movement pockets, and we need labor and all social movement sectors and donors, and especially the climate justice movement to invest in some serious analysis about who are the special, players, the stakeholders, the special interest groups that are profiteering off of this current fire crisis that we're facing, using this as an agent to create urgency around the fast tracking of running roughshod over Indigenous communities and setting up new sacrifice zones so shareholders can get wicked rich off of war and all of that sort of thing. These proposals have people and institutions, companies, politicians attached to them. We need to map that out, and the right of way of pipelines, of proposed coal train lines, of freeways in the Arctic, up in the NWT, of whatever the heck they're planning in James Bay on that side of Hudson Bay. We need to map that shit out and get serious about organizing on that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. very spirited discussion. Really interesting to hear you guys. You gave lots of food for thought and ideas for action, which is what we want. So thank you to Clayton, to Joel, to Eriel, Sabrina, and Karl. It was great to have you on the panel today. And just to the audience out there, this is our last Off the Hill for the summer. We will be back in September with lots of topics and lots of things to get into. So I do want to thank rabble.ca and the staff for hosting tonight's panel. They do a lot of hard work to bring this panel together every month. If you'd like to support the show and also support the other work that Rabble does, please consider donating to Rabble. Particularly a monthly donor is very helpful. You can just go to rabble.ca/donate. So again, thank you to everybody for this great discussion, and we will see you in September.
Thanks, everybody.
Donate to Rabble.
Stay safe. All right, bye.